Okay, so we're going to do one last video here where we go through kind of more generally what the intro and discussion are about, and we're going to go through them in terms of their paragraphs as the unit of inquiry, and then we're going to talk about briefly the methods and results and how we might go through and read those. And then we'll think about how do we summarize this. Maybe we'll look at the second paper too. So, once we're done reading those three important paragraphs, the abstract, the last paragraph of the introduction, and the last paragraph of the discussion, there's some other important paragraphs we might want to read. For instance, like the first paragraph of the discussion is usually quite a good summary of the paper as well. We show that good quality EEG can be obtained in such adverse recording conditions as walking outside. And so they're already kind of describing the results and discussing them in terms of the literature. We present here a low-cost EEG platform that facilitates mobile EEG applications. So one thing you should notice is that these scientific papers are quite repetitive. The abstract is saying the same thing as this last paragraph of the introduction, which is said again really in the discussion. And that's important when we write in scientific writing because we want to get our point across clearly. It's not really about style points, and it's not about how eloquently you can describe what you're talking about. You want to describe it so clearly that anyone can understand from reading the paper. And so repeating yourself, repeating the important aspects of the paper, again, in the abstract, in the introduction, and the discussion is one important way that you can do that. So now let's think more generally about reading the discussion and the introduction. We can read these in terms of their paragraphs. We can kind of try to look at what is each paragraph roughly about. Remember from your writing classes that you should write kind of a topic sentence at the start of each paragraph. And you can usually also write one at the end of each paragraph. So this paragraph starts with EEG systems can be made small enough to not distract the user in wireless transmissions possible. And so this whole paragraph then is about those things. And they go through these different references and talk about what they might find. And then additionally, systems should have no loose cables. This is a relatively short paper, so it's a little bit less obvious in this paper. But usually you can read the first and last sentences of some of these paragraphs to get a sense of what they're about. So now we can just go through, after we've read the important abstract last paragraph of the intro and the first paragraph of the discussion, we can kind of read the first and last sentence of each paragraph and think about what each one's about. Communication tool, BCI. So this paragraph is about BCIs. And this first paragraph, non-invasive technologies for the study of human brain activity suffer from the requirement that subjects avoid gross movement, kind of puts forward the problem. So we should be able to summarize in a sentence what each paragraph says when we go through and read a paper like this. Same for the discussion, that we might say, oh, this paragraph here, what is it about? Okay, well, the hardware used was of sufficient quality to achieve the competitive auditory P300 PCI classification performance. And so you can read through, oh, this seems like it was doing just as well as you would need, and then suggest some other ways to further improve it. So a discussion really situates the results of the paper in terms of the other literature. Here's another interesting question they talk about in this paragraph. And so that's the same for any paper. If we pick this other paper, Olav's paper instead, we can read the abstract. We can read the last sentence of the introduction, which again says, our hypothesis was simple. We predicted that we would be able to see and quantify the M2 and P3 from the Muse system. Right? So you can just glance at these papers and read one paragraph and get a sense of what they're talking about. Again, here's the first paragraph of the discussion in the same way, where they say the results demonstrate this, we did this, and we did that. So they were very repetitive, and they are repeated over and over again. And again, sometimes these papers will have headings in the discussion or the conclusion as well, which can better even track your reading of the paper and focus you on the important information. Okay, so one last thing we should probably talk about is the meat of the paper, the results and the methods. And these become interesting the further we get in our project. So once we start writing our methods, it's going to be more and more relevant to read the methods of other papers. Usually method sections have some generic sections like the participants describing who took part in the study, the stimuli and the task, like what materials did you use that someone else would need to use to recreate your experiment. So here they describe the tones that they used and how many trials they used, what the people did, where they walked around, what the routes were that they walked around, what they told them to do, right, and how they counterbalanced everything, and then what software they were using. Then it talks about the Eeg hardware itself. So they used this 14-channel Eeg system, and they fixed it in this certain way so they could use it. They used these electrodes at these electrode locations. Then they connected them in this certain way. And again, they used this software. Then they talk about the analysis. So how did you actually do the analysis? And we'll talk more about this when we start to work on our analysis. So first they want to look at the ERPs themselves. And the important stuff that you'll see again and again in these papers is that you filter the data and you take out these chunks of data, which are called epochs or trials, that go from before to after the stimulus, and you average them all together. And so that's an important step. And then they might show how they do statistical analysis. They take out these different measures and they average them together, and they might do t-tests, or they might compare them with an ANOVA. Okay, and they've set all this up so that now the results are quite easy to describe. The results we've already looked at visually in these two figures. But we can also go through and read these results briefly. We don't have to get bogged down in all the numbers and all these symbols. We can just look at the sentences that they're writing. Deviant ERPs evoked a P3, which was evident in both the indoor and outdoor recordings from figure 1. I agree, they can see that ERP there. Then they talk about what was significant, what wasn't significant, where it was bigger, where it was smaller. So they're doing all these as different tests to check how reliable these effects are in their data. They report different correlations as well. And then the discussion they spend kind of discussing those results. So here are the results all laid out, figure 1 and figure 2. And then the discussion can kind of go through and talk about how those results are important with respect to the rest of the literature. So you can picture now doing that same kind of exercise for any paper that you might come across. You might come across Olav's paper here. You might read the abstract, read the introductions, last sentence. You might go through and look at the figures and make sure, this is what the task is like. That's what people were doing in the task. Then you can start to look at the results and see, okay, here's some ERPs and the two conditions. And once you start to get a sense of the results and you've read the summaries in the paper, then you're already in a position where you can probably write a little sentence to summarize these 4 questions. What did they think? Which in other words is like, why do the experiment? And then what did they test, or how did they do the experiment? What did they find? And then what does it mean? And so in terms of this study that we've just read, this how about taking a low-cost portable EEG for a walk, we can think about the answers to each of those questions. They thought, or why did they do the experiment? It's because they wanted to build a low-cost, small and wireless EEG system. So this kind of engineering problems are easy to answer in terms of why you do the experiment, because you want to know if it works. You want to know if this EEG system would work in this situation. to test it, they had people do this auditory task, and they had them either sit in the lab or walk around outside. What they found was that you could get clear P3s when you were inside or when you were outside, that they were a little bit smaller when you were outside, and they also found that you could classify with a computer whether people were hearing a tone that they were counting or a tone that they were ignoring with good accuracy. And then finally, what does it mean in terms of this paper and the bigger literature? This really means that this opened the doors for a great deal of researchers to go out and think about how they could use mobile EEG in different situations like this. So it kind of opened up an opportunity and showed, hey, look, you can measure EEG quite well in this situation of walking around. What should we do next? Okay, so if you were to go through and read 10 or 20 papers and pick 10 that you like and summarize them in this way, you'd be doing an excellent job on this part of the assignment. Please let me know if you have any questions over email, and I can bring them up with the rest of the class as well. And thanks for listening.